Hey there, how's it going? Thanks for joining me today. Whether you're relaxing at home, on your commute, or winding down for the evening, I'm really glad you're here. Now, I want you to imagine something with me. Picture yourself standing on a rocky coast in Newfoundland, Canada. The wind is whipping through your hair, the Atlantic Ocean stretches endlessly before you, and you're looking at something that completely changes everything we thought we knew about American history. Because here's the thing that's going to blow your mind. 500 years before Christopher Columbus ever thought about sailing west, bearded warriors from the frozen fjords of Scandinavia were already walking on American soil. I know. You're probably thinking, wait, what? The Vikings were in America? Oh yes, they absolutely were. And the story of how we figured this out? It reads like the greatest archaeological detective story ever told. So let's go back to the year 1000. Not 1900, not 1800. I'm talking about the actual year 1000. While most of Europe was still figuring out basic farming techniques, these incredible seafarers from Norway, Denmark, and Iceland were pulling off ocean voyages that would make modern sailors nervous. Picture this scene. Leif Erikson, and yes, that's a real person, not just a character from your history textbook, is standing on the deck of his longship. This isn't some massive vessel like the ships Columbus would use centuries later. We're talking about a wooden boat that's only 35 feet long. 35 feet, that's smaller than most modern yachts, and this guy is using it to cross the North Atlantic. But here's where it gets really fascinating. These weren't primitive boats held together with hope and prayer. Viking longships represented absolutely cutting-edge technology for their time. The hulls were built to be flexible, and I mean that literally. Instead of rigid construction that would crack and break when hit by massive ocean swells, these ships were designed to bend and flex with the waves. It's like the difference between a rigid piece of wood that snaps under pressure versus a piece of bamboo that bends and springs back. The Vikings had figured out something that took other shipbuilders centuries to understand. The ocean doesn't fight fair. So you don't fight the ocean. You work with it. Now, you might be wondering, how did they even know where they were going? I mean, we're talking about 1,000 years before GPS, before compasses were widely used in Europe, before any of the navigation technology we take for granted today. So how did Leif Erikson navigate across thousands of miles of open ocean? Here's where the story gets almost magical. The Vikings used something called sunstones, special crystals that could split sunlight into rainbows and reveal the sun's position even on completely cloudy days. These weren't mythical artifacts from some fantasy novel. These were real optical crystals, probably Iceland spar, that work on principles of light polarization that we didn't fully understand scientifically until the 20th century. Think about that for a second. A Viking navigator could pull out one of these crystal stones, hold it up to an overcast sky, and find the sun. In the middle of the North Atlantic, with no land in sight for hundreds of miles, they could determine their direction with precision that would make early European explorers jealous. But the navigation was just the beginning. These Vikings weren't just making lucky guesses about where to sail. They had developed a systematic approach to exploration that was generations ahead of its time. They would send out scouting expeditions, map coastlines, identify good harbors, and then, and this is the crucial part, they would go back and get more people. This is exactly what happened with Iceland. Around 870, Norwegian explorers discovered this massive island in the North Atlantic. Instead of just claiming it and moving on, they went back to Norway and organized proper settlement expeditions. Within decades, Iceland had a thriving Norse population with farms, communities, and even their own parliament, the Althing, which started meeting in 930 and is still functioning today. Then they did it again with Greenland. Erik the Red, Leif Erikson's father, discovered Greenland around 985. But here's the brilliant part. He didn't call it frozen wasteland or rocky island. He called it Greenland. That's some seriously clever marketing right there. He knew that if he wanted people to join him in settling this new territory, he needed to make it sound appealing. And it worked. By the year 1000, Greenland had several thousand Norse settlers living in two main communities. the eastern settlement and the western settlement. They were raising cattle, growing crops during the short summers, and creating a genuinely sustainable colony in one of the harshest environments on Earth. So when Leif Erikson decided to sail even further west from Greenland, he wasn't just making a wild leap into the unknown. He was following a proven pattern of Norse exploration and settlement. He had the technology, the knowledge, and the confidence that came from generations of successful Viking expansion. The journey from Greenland to North America was actually the shortest leg of the overall voyage from Norway. We're talking about maybe 500 miles of open water. Challenging, yes, but nothing compared to the original crossing from Iceland to Greenland, or from Norway to Iceland. And when Leif and his crew made landfall somewhere on the North American coast, probably in what we now call Newfoundland, they found something extraordinary. Not just land, but good land. Land with forests full of timber that was desperately needed back in Greenland. Land with wild grapes that could be turned into wine. Land with salmon runs that could feed an entire settlement. They called it Vinland, the land of wine. And according to the Icelandic sagas, these weren't just brief visits. The Vikings established an actual settlement. They built houses, they brought livestock, they planned to stay. Now, here's where our story takes an incredible turn. For almost 1,000 years, these accounts existed only in medieval Icelandic texts called sagas, beautiful, detailed stories about heroes and adventures and distant lands. But most historians treated them like mythology, fantasy literature, epic poems that mixed a little bit of truth with a whole lot of imagination. I mean, think about it from a scholar's perspective. These stories claimed that Vikings had reached America 5 centuries before Columbus. They described places that sounded almost too good to be true, and they were written down generations after the events supposedly happened, passed along through oral tradition like ancient versions of campfire stories. So for centuries, the idea of Vikings in America remained in the realm of legend, until 1960. Picture this scene. Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad and his wife Anne Steen Ingstad are walking across windswept meadows in northern Newfoundland. Helge is an Arctic explorer and writer who has spent decades studying Norse history. Anne Stein is a trained archaeologist with a sharp eye for details that other people miss. They're not just wandering around randomly, they're on a mission. Helge has been studying the old Icelandic sagas for years, trying to figure out where Vinland might have been located. He's looked at the geographical descriptions, analyzed the sailing directions, and calculated where Vikings coming from Greenland would most likely have made landfall. His research has pointed him to this remote stretch of Newfoundland coast, near a tiny fishing village called Lanceaux Meadows. The name itself is intriguing. It's a French corruption of an earlier name that might have meant the bay by the meadows. When Helge and Anne Stein arrive in Lanceaux Meadows, they start talking to local fishermen. And that's when they hear about something interesting. Strange mounds in the nearby meadows. Unusual bumps in the landscape that don't quite look natural. Most people would have walked right past these mounds without giving them a second thought. They just look like grassy hills. But Anne Stein Ingstad has the trained eye of an archaeologist, and something about these formations catches her attention. She starts to see patterns. The mounds are arranged in ways that suggest human construction. There are depressions that might have been house floors. There are ridges that could be the remains of walls. So they start to dig, and what emerges from the soil changes everything we thought we knew about American history. The first artifacts are small but significant. Pieces of charcoal from fires that burned long ago. Iron nails that are clearly of Scandinavian design. Fragments of copper and bronze that had to come from somewhere across the Atlantic. But then comes the discovery that proves everything. Anne Stein finds a small bronze pin, exactly the type worn by Viking women in Iceland and Greenland. It's a simple object, but it might as well be a smoking gun. This isn't something that could have gotten to Newfoundland by accident. This is clear evidence of Norse presence. The excavation continues for years. They uncover the foundations of 8 buildings, including what's clearly a large hall that matches descriptions of Viking longhouses. They find a forge where iron was worked, the only such site from this time period anywhere in North America. They discover a specialized hut, where bog iron was processed into usable metal. Most importantly, they find evidence of daily life: cooking hearths, sleeping areas, workshops. This wasn't just a temporary camp or a brief stop for repairs. This was a functioning settlement where people lived and worked and planned for the future. The carbon dating results come back with dates around 1,000 years ago, exactly when the sagas said Vikings reached Vinland. Think about what this means. For almost 1,000 years, these stories had been dismissed as mythology. Scholars had argued that medieval Icelanders were just making up exciting tales about their ancestors. The idea that Vikings could have reached America seemed impossible, impractical, too incredible to believe. And then, in the soil of a remote Newfoundland meadow, the proof emerges. The sagas weren't mythology, they were history. But here's where our story gets even more fascinating. The archaeological evidence at Lanseaux Meadows shows that Vikings definitely reached America and definitely established a settlement. But it also shows that they didn't stay very long, maybe a few years, maybe a decade at most. And then they were gone. So the big question becomes, why didn't they stay? These were people who had successfully colonized Iceland and Greenland, some of the most challenging environments on Earth. They had the technology, the skills, and the determination to build lasting settlements in places where survival required incredible ingenuity. Why would they abandon a place like Vinland, which offered timber, wild grapes, good fishing, and fertile soil? Why would they give up on what could have been the most successful Viking colony ever established? That question, why Vikings didn't stay in America, leads us into one of the most fascinating what-if scenarios in all of history. Because if they had stayed, if more ships had followed, if Viking settlements had taken root and grown along the North American coast, the entire story of European contact with the Americas would have been completely different. We're talking about a scenario where Norse longhouses dotted the coasts of what we now call New England 500 years before the Mayflower, where Old Norse became the first European language to take root in the New World, where cultural exchange between Vikings and indigenous peoples created something entirely new and unprecedented. Instead of the devastating collision between European diseases and Native American populations that defined later colonization, we might have seen gradual contact that allowed indigenous communities to develop immunity over generations. Instead of conquest and displacement, we might have seen partnership and cultural blending. The America that could have emerged from successful Viking colonization would have been unlike anything we can imagine from our current historical perspective. And the more we understand about what Vikings actually accomplished, the incredible distances they traveled, the sophisticated technology they developed, the sustainable settlements they created in places like Iceland and Greenland, the more we realize that this wasn't just possible, it was probable. So, as we dive deeper into this story, we're not just exploring what happened, we're exploring what almost happened. We're examining one of those crucial moments in history where a small change, maybe just a few more ships, maybe a slightly different decision by a handful of people, could have altered the course of an entire continent. The Vikings who reached America weren't just lucky adventurers stumbling onto a new land. They were part of a sophisticated culture of exploration and settlement that had already proven its success across the North Atlantic. They had the tools, the knowledge, and the experience to build something lasting in the New World. The question isn't whether they could have done it. The question is, what stopped them? And that's where our story really begins to get interesting. So now that we know Vikings actually made it to America and established a real settlement, let's dive into the most fascinating question of all. What if they had decided to stay? What if that small outpost at Lanseaux Meadows had become the beginning of something much, much bigger? To understand what Viking America might have looked like, we need to step into an alternate timeline. A world where Thorfinn Karlsefni's pregnant wife Gudrid doesn't give birth to just a footnote in history, but to the very first generation of Norse Americans. Picture this scene. It's the year 1004. Gudrid Thorbjarnadottir is holding her newborn son Snorri in a wooden longhouse on the shores of what we now call Newfoundland. But in this timeline, this isn't a temporary shelter that will be abandoned in a few years. This is home, The first Norse American home. Little Snorri grows up speaking Old Norse with his parents and Algonquian languages with the indigenous children who become his playmates. He learns to read runes carved into birch bark, to navigate forest trails that his Viking father could never master alone, and to identify edible plants that his mother's Icelandic farming knowledge never included. This is where our alternate history really begins to get incredible. Let's say that instead of the historical 30 or 40 people who made up the Landsort Meadows settlement, word gets back to Greenland that Vinland is everything the early explorers claimed. Not just a place to gather timber and explore, but genuine territory that could support large-scale settlement. The next spring, 3 more ships arrive from Greenland, then 5 ships the following year. By 1010, there are 300 Norse settlers spread across half a dozen coastal settlements from Newfoundland down to what we now call Nova Scotia. Here's what's fascinating about how this expansion would have worked. Vikings weren't random raiders who showed up and hoped for the best. They had developed a systematic approach to colonization that had already proven successful in Iceland and Greenland. First, they would establish a main settlement with a proper harbour that could accommodate multiple longships. This becomes the political and economic centre, with a great hall where the local Thing assembly meets to make decisions about laws, trade agreements, and settlement expansion. Around this central hub, they would establish smaller farming settlements, each positioned to take advantage of different resources. Some focus on agriculture, growing the hardy crops that Vikings had learned to cultivate in short growing seasons. Others specialize in fishing, hunting, or gathering specific materials like timber or iron ore. The key insight is that Vikings understood something that many later European colonists missed. Successful settlement requires adapting to local conditions, not trying to recreate exactly what you had back home. So, in our alternate timeline, Norse settlers quickly realize that American conditions offer opportunities that didn't exist in Iceland or Greenland. The forests of Newfoundland and New England provide unlimited timber for shipbuilding and construction. Wild grapes really can be turned into wine, creating a luxury product that could be traded back to Europe for enormous profit. Most importantly, the climate is actually better than what they left behind in Greenland. Growing seasons are longer, winters are less harsh, and there's much more biodiversity to support larger populations. By the year 1020, let's imagine that New Vinland has grown from 300 settlers to 3,000. The original settlement has evolved into something that looks like a proper Norse town, with dozens of longhouses, workshops for metalworking and shipbuilding, storage facilities for grain and preserved fish, and even the beginnings of what might become North America's first European-style church. But here's where the story gets really interesting. This isn't just Iceland West. This is something entirely new, because Vikings in America would be developing, alongside indigenous peoples, in ways that never happened in their previous settlements. In Iceland, Vikings encountered no native population. In Greenland, they had limited contact with Inuit peoples. But in North America, they're establishing settlements in territories that are already home to sophisticated indigenous societies. The Mi'kmaq people of the Maritimes, the Beothuk of Newfoundland, and the various Algonquian-speaking peoples of New England weren't primitive hunter-gatherers waiting to be civilized. They were complex societies with their own technologies, trade networks, and political systems. So, unlike the historical pattern of European colonization centuries later, Viking settlement would have developed through negotiation, trade, and gradual integration rather than conquest and displacement. Picture trade relationships developing between Norse settlements and indigenous communities. Vikings offer iron tools, woolen textiles, and metalworking techniques. Indigenous peoples share knowledge about local resources, forest navigation, and agricultural techniques adapted to American conditions. Most crucially, they share knowledge about food. Vikings were skilled at preserving fish and raising livestock, but indigenous peoples knew which local plants were edible, medicinal, or useful for crafts. They knew migration patterns of animals that didn't exist in Europe. They understood seasonal cycles that were completely different from anything Vikings had experienced. The result would be hybrid communities that combined the best of both worlds. Norse longhouses built using indigenous construction techniques that were better adapted to local weather patterns. Agricultural systems that combined Scandinavian livestock with Native American crops like corn, beans, and squash. By 1050, our alternate New Vinland might stretch from Greenland down to what we now call Massachusetts. Not as a unified kingdom, but as a network of allied settlements that maintain connections through trade, intermarriage, and shared cultural institutions. Children in these communities grow up truly bicultural. They learn Old Norse and Algonquian languages with equal fluency. They're equally comfortable in longhouses and wigwams. They practice both Norse and indigenous spiritual traditions, creating new hybrid ceremonies that honor both ancestral backgrounds. This is something that never existed anywhere else in the medieval world. A genuine fusion of European and indigenous American cultures developing over generations of peaceful coexistence. The economic implications would be staggering. By 1100, Norse American traders might be regularly sailing back to Europe with cargoes that include not just traditional products like timber and furs, but uniquely American goods like tobacco, corn, and medicinal plants that Europeans had never encountered. Imagine Viking longships arriving in Bergen or Dublin with holds full of American silver, copper, and exotic foods. The profits from this trade would fund continued expansion and attract even more settlers from Scandinavia. But the cultural exchange would flow both ways. New Vinland would be receiving not just Norse settlers, but also Irish monks, Scottish farmers, and maybe even merchants from as far away as Byzantium, who were attracted by stories of this new land of opportunity. By 1200, we might see the emergence of the first truly American cities. Not European cities transplanted to America, but genuinely new urban centers that combined Norse political traditions with indigenous knowledge and American resources. Picture walking through the streets of what might have been called New Bergen, built where the Hudson River meets the sea. Longhouses and log cabins line broad avenues laid out according to Norse town planning principles. The central square features both a Viking Thing assembly area and indigenous council circles, where leaders from different communities meet to make decisions. The harbour bustles with activity as longships arrive from Greenland and Iceland, while indigenous canoes bring goods from trading partners hundreds of miles inland. Children run through the streets, speaking 3 or 4 languages fluently, while craftsmen in workshops combine Norse metalworking techniques with indigenous materials to create tools and artwork that exist nowhere else in the world. This isn't fantasy. Every element of this scenario is based on documented Viking capabilities and established patterns of cultural exchange. The technology existed, the navigation knowledge existed, the social systems existed, and the precedent for successful Norse colonization had already been proven in Iceland and Greenland. The only question is, what would have happened when this thriving Norse American civilization encountered other European powers? Because by the year 1200, our alternate timeline would be setting up one of the most dramatic confrontations in history, not between European explorers and scattered indigenous tribes, but between established Norse American confederations and the Spanish, French, and English empires that were beginning to look westward across the Atlantic. When Spanish conquistadors finally sailed north from the Caribbean in the early 1500s, they wouldn't be encountering unexplored wilderness. They would be facing organized Norse American societies with metal weapons, naval technology, and political alliances that spanned the continent. The meeting between Spanish steel and Viking iron would create an entirely different dynamic than the historical conquest of the Americas. Instead of technological superiority allowing European domination, we'd be looking at something much more like the confrontations between European powers and established Asian or Middle Eastern empires. But before we get to that epic confrontation, we need to understand something crucial about how this Norse American civilization would have developed. Because the key to understanding alternate history isn't just imagining what might have been different, it's understanding what would have stayed the same. And what would have stayed the same is that successful societies require adaptation, innovation, and the ability to solve problems that their ancestors never faced. The Vikings who might have built America wouldn't have been exactly like the Vikings who raided England or settled Iceland. They would have been shaped by American conditions, indigenous knowledge, and the unique challenges of building something completely new. By the time Spanish explorers encountered them centuries later, these Norse Americans would have evolved into something that was neither purely European nor purely indigenous, but genuinely and uniquely American. That transformation, from Scandinavian seafarers to American innovators, would have created a civilization unlike anything that existed anywhere else in the medieval world. And the ripple effects of that transformation would have changed not just American history, but the entire trajectory of global development. Now we're getting to the heart of what makes this alternate history so fascinating. Because the real game changer isn't just that Vikings stayed in America, it's how their presence would have completely transformed the relationship between European and indigenous peoples. When we think about European colonization of the Americas, we're used to a story of devastating collision. Europeans arrive with diseases that wipe out massive indigenous populations, superior military technology that allows rapid conquest, and cultural attitudes that treat native peoples as obstacles to be removed rather than partners to work with. But Viking America would have been different. Fundamentally, dramatically different. Here's why. Sustained Norse presence would have allowed for gradual cultural exchange instead of sudden catastrophic contact. Let me paint you a picture of how this would actually work. It's the year 1015. A Mi'kmaq hunting party encounters a group of Norse settlers who are struggling to track deer through unfamiliar forest terrain. Now, in the historical timeline, this might have been a brief encounter. Maybe some cautious trading, maybe some conflict, maybe both sides just avoiding each other. But in our alternate timeline, these Norse settlers aren't just passing through. They're neighbors. They're planning to be here for generations. So the encounter develops differently. The Mi'kmaq hunters see that these Norse people have useful metal tools but lack basic knowledge about forest survival. The Norse settlers recognize that these indigenous hunters possess skills that could mean the difference between successful settlement and starvation. What emerges is something like an apprenticeship system. Mi'kmaq hunters teach Norse settlers to read animal tracks, to identify which plants are edible in different seasons, to understand weather patterns that are completely different from anything in Scandinavia. In exchange, Norse metalworkers share techniques for forging iron tools, for working with bronze, for creating implements that are more durable and effective than anything made from stone or bone. But here's the crucial part. This isn't a one-time exchange. These communities are going to be living alongside each other for decades, for centuries. So the knowledge sharing becomes deeper and more sophisticated over time. Norse women learn indigenous techniques for food preservation that work better in American climates than traditional Scandinavian methods. Indigenous communities discover that Norse woolen textiles provide better insulation during winter than traditional fur clothing. Most importantly, the children grow up learning from both traditions. Picture young Snorri Thorfinnsson, our first Norse American, playing with Mi'kmaq children near the settlement. They're not just casual playmates. They're growing up together, learning each other's languages, absorbing both cultural traditions as if they were equally natural. Snorri learns to navigate forest trails with the silent precision of an indigenous hunter, but he also learns Norse sailing techniques and metalworking skills. His Mi'kmaq friends learn Old Norse and gain access to iron tools, but they also maintain their own cultural knowledge about local ecosystems and traditional crafts. When these children reach adulthood, they don't see Norse and indigenous cultures as separate competing systems. They see them as complementary approaches to solving the challenges of life in North America. And then, intermarriage begins. This is where our alternate timeline really diverges from historical patterns. In the actual timeline, European indigenous intermarriage certainly happened, but it usually occurred in the context of conquest, displacement, or economic exploitation. In Viking America, intermarriage would happen between communities that see each other as equals. Norse men marry indigenous women not as a form of cultural domination, but as genuine partnerships between families that respect both traditions. More surprisingly, Norse women also marry into indigenous communities. This was actually quite common in Norse society. Women had more rights and autonomy than in most medieval European cultures, including the right to choose their own husbands and to inherit property. So you get Norse women who choose to live in indigenous communities because they prefer the social structures, the environmental knowledge, or simply because they fall in love with someone from a different cultural background. The children of these marriages become cultural bridges in the most literal sense. They're equally fluent in Old Norse and Algonquian languages. They're comfortable in longhouses and wigwams. They can forge iron tools and weave traditional baskets with equal skill. By the year 1050, the distinction between Norse and indigenous communities starts to blur. You have settlements that are clearly influenced by both traditions, where longhouse architecture incorporates indigenous construction techniques, where Norse agricultural methods are adapted using indigenous knowledge about local soil and climate conditions. But the most important change, the one that would have altered the entire trajectory of American history, is disease immunity. Here's something most people don't realize about the catastrophic epidemics that devastated indigenous populations after European contact. They were so deadly, partly because the contact was so sudden and massive. When Columbus arrived in the Caribbean, he brought European diseases to populations that had been completely isolated from Old World pathogens for thousands of years. The result was demographic collapse that killed an estimated 90% of indigenous Americans within a century. But gradual contact over generations would have produced a completely different outcome. In our Viking America timeline, European diseases would still be introduced to indigenous populations, but instead of arriving all at once through massive expeditions, they would be introduced slowly through small-scale contact with Norse settlers. Some people would still get sick and die. That's unavoidable when populations with different disease histories encounter each other. But gradual exposure would allow indigenous communities to develop immunity over generations instead of facing complete demographic collapse. Think about how this changes everything. Instead of European colonization arriving to find a continent depopulated by disease, later Spanish and French explorers would encounter indigenous societies that had already adapted to European pathogens and maintained their population levels. By the year 1200, you might have indigenous Norse hybrid communities that combine the best aspects of both traditions. Indigenous knowledge about American ecosystems and Norse technologies like ironworking and shipbuilding, plus populations that are immune to both Old World and New World diseases. These communities would represent something completely new in human history, genuinely bicultural societies that preserved knowledge from both European and indigenous traditions, while developing innovations that neither culture could have achieved alone. For example, imagine hybrid agricultural systems that combine Norse livestock with indigenous crop rotation techniques, cattle and sheep grazing on land managed using traditional indigenous fire practices that maintain grassland ecosystems, corn, beans, and squash, grown alongside barley and rye, using soil management techniques that draw from both Scandinavian and American farming traditions. Or consider maritime technology that combines Norse shipbuilding with indigenous knowledge about coastal navigation. Longships modified with birch bark components that make them lighter and more maneuverable in shallow American waters. Navigation techniques that use both Norse sunstones and indigenous knowledge about seasonal patterns, wildlife behavior, and coastal landmarks. These aren't just theoretical possibilities. We know that Vikings were incredibly practical people who adapted their technologies to local conditions. We also know that indigenous Americans had sophisticated knowledge systems that European colonists eventually learned to depend on. The difference is that in our alternate timeline, this knowledge sharing would happen between equals rather than between conquerors and conquered peoples. By the year 1300, Norse indigenous hybrid communities might be developing technologies and social systems that don't exist anywhere else in the world. Political assemblies that combine Norse Thing traditions with indigenous council methods, legal systems that incorporate both European concepts of individual property rights and indigenous concepts of collective resource management. Most intriguingly, you might see the development of hybrid spiritual traditions that honor both Norse and indigenous ancestors, that celebrate both European and American seasonal cycles, that incorporate both Christian and traditional indigenous ceremonial practices. This is something that actually happened in Iceland when Norse settlers encountered Irish monks and Celtic cultural traditions. The result was a uniquely Icelandic culture that preserved elements from multiple traditions while developing new innovations that were distinctly Icelandic. In North America, with much more cultural diversity and much richer natural resources, the fusion process would be even more complex and creative. By the time other European powers begin serious exploration of North America in the 1500s, they wouldn't be encountering scattered indigenous tribes struggling to recover from epidemic diseases. They would be facing established Norse indigenous confederations with sophisticated political systems, advanced technologies, and populations that were healthy, numerous, and well organized. The Spanish conquistadors who devastated the Aztec and Inca empires through a combination of disease, superior weapons, and political manipulation would find themselves facing a completely different situation in North America. Instead of technological superiority, they would be confronting societies that had already adapted European metalworking and weapons technology, while maintaining indigenous knowledge about American geography and resources. Instead of populations weakened by epidemic disease, they would be facing communities that had developed immunity to European pathogens, while maintaining traditional knowledge about local medicine and nutrition. Instead of politically fragmented tribes that could be played against each other, they would be dealing with sophisticated confederations that had been practicing diplomatic relations between different cultural groups for centuries. The encounter between Spanish colonial expansion and Norse indigenous America would create a dynamic unlike anything that occurred in our historical timeline. But before we explore that epic confrontation, we need to understand how the modern world discovered this forgotten chapter of American history. Because the story of how archaeologists figured out that Vikings really had reached America is almost as dramatic as the alternate history we're exploring. And it all started with two Norwegian explorers walking across windswept meadows in Newfoundland, looking for proof that the medieval sagas weren't just beautiful stories, but actual historical records. All right, let's step back from our fascinating alternate timeline for a moment and dive into one of the greatest archaeological detective stories of the 20th century. Because the way we figured out that Vikings really had reached America reads like a mystery novel, with plot twists, false leads, dead ends, and finally, a breakthrough that changed everything we thought we knew about history. The story begins with something that sounds almost too perfect to be true: ancient Icelandic texts that describe Viking voyages to a mysterious land called Vinland, where grapes grew wild and timber was abundant. These texts are called sagas, and they're some of the most beautiful literature ever written: epic stories of heroes and adventures, family feuds and heroic voyages, gods and monsters, and larger-than-life characters who sail across unknown seas to discover new worlds. For centuries, scholars treated these stories exactly like what they appeared to be: mythology, fantasy literature, epic poems that mixed a little bit of historical truth with a whole lot of imaginative storytelling. I mean, think about it from a medieval historian's perspective. These sagas claimed that Vikings had reached America 500 years before Columbus. They described places that sounded almost too good to be true: lands with unlimited timber, wild grapes that could be turned into wine, rivers teeming with salmon, and native peoples who sometimes traded and sometimes fought with the Norse explorers. The stories were written down in Iceland during the 13th and 14th centuries, at least 200 years after the events they claimed to describe. They had been passed along through oral tradition, from generation to generation, like ancient versions of campfire stories. Even worse, from a historian's point of view, different sagas told slightly different versions of the same events. The saga of Eric the Red said one thing about Leif Eriksson's voyage to Vinland. The saga of the Greenlanders said something slightly different. Details didn't always match up perfectly. So, for almost 600 years, the idea of Vikings in America remained in the realm of legend. Scholars studied the sagas as literature, not as historical documents. They were beautiful stories, but they weren't considered reliable sources for actual events. But here's where our detective story really begins. In the early 1900s, a few scholars started to take a closer look at these ancient texts, and they began to notice something interesting. The geographical descriptions in the sagas were remarkably detailed and consistent. The stories described sailing routes that made sense given what we know about Viking navigation techniques. They mentioned landmarks and natural features that corresponded to real places along the North American coast. Most intriguingly, the sagas described 3 different regions that Vikings had discovered during their westward explorations. Helluland, which means flat stone land, Markland, which means forest land, and Vinland, which means wine land, or possibly meadow land. When 20th century scholars plotted these descriptions against actual North American geography, something remarkable emerged. Helluland sounded exactly like Baffin Island, with its flat, rocky terrain. Markland matched the heavily forested coast of Labrador, and Vinland could correspond to the northern tip of Newfoundland, where wild berries grew abundantly and meadows provided good grazing for livestock. But having a theory is one thing, proving it is something else entirely. Enter Helge Ingstad, a Norwegian explorer and writer who had spent decades in the Arctic studying Norse history and culture. Helge wasn't just an armchair scholar reading ancient texts in a university library. He was an experienced Arctic explorer who understood sailing conditions, navigation challenges, and what it actually took to establish settlements in harsh northern climates. In the 1950s, Helge became convinced that the sagas weren't mythology. He believed they were historical accounts that could be verified through archaeological investigation. But where to look? The sagas provided clues, but they weren't exactly detailed maps. They mentioned sailing times, wind directions, and geographical features, but they were written for people who were already familiar with North Atlantic navigation. For modern scholars, they were like following directions that assumed you already knew the territory. Helge spent years analyzing the saga accounts, studying ocean currents and wind patterns, and calculating where Vikings sailing from Greenland would most likely have made landfall on the North American coast. His research pointed him to the northern tip of Newfoundland, particularly an area around a remote fishing village called Lanceauque Meadows. The name itself was intriguing. Lanceauque Meadows is French for Jellyfish Bay, but local pronunciation had corrupted it to Lanceauque Meadows. And meadows was exactly the kind of landscape feature that the sagas associated with Vinland. So, in 1960, Helge Ingstad and his wife Anne Stein Ingstad travelled to Lanceauque Meadows to see what they could find. Anne Stein, by the way, was not just along for the ride. She was a trained archaeologist with extensive experience in field excavation and artifact analysis. This wasn't a husband and wife hobby expedition. This was serious archaeological investigation conducted by people who knew exactly what they were doing. When they arrived in Lanceauque Meadows, they started by talking to local residents, and that's when they heard about something that caught their attention: strange mounds in the nearby meadows that didn't look quite natural. Most visitors to Lanceauque Meadows today walk right past these features without noticing anything unusual. They just look like grassy hills. But Anne Stein Ingstad had the trained eye of an archaeologist, and something about these formations intrigued her. She started to see patterns. The mounds were arranged in ways that suggested human construction. There were depressions that might have been house floors. There were ridges that could be the remains of walls. The spacing and orientation looked like it might represent the layout of a deliberate settlement, so they decided to start a small test excavation, just to see what might be buried under centuries of accumulated soil and vegetation. And what they found changed everything. The first artifacts were small but significant: pieces of charcoal from fires that had burned long ago, iron nails of a distinctly Scandinavian design, fragments of copper and bronze that clearly hadn't been made by indigenous peoples who didn't work with these metals. But then came the discovery that proved everything. Anne Stein found a small bronze pin, exactly the type worn by Viking women in Iceland and Greenland during the early medieval period. Now, think about what this means. This wasn't some generic artifact that could have come from anywhere. This was a specific type of clothing fastener that was made in Scandinavia during a specific time period. There was absolutely no way it could have gotten to Newfoundland except by being brought there by Norse people. It was like finding a smoking gun at a crime scene. But the Ingstads were too good as archaeologists to jump to conclusions based on a single artifact. They expanded their excavation, bringing in additional experts and using increasingly sophisticated techniques to uncover and analyze what lay buried in the Lancer-aux Meadows site. What emerged over the next several years was evidence of a complete Norse settlement. They uncovered the foundations of 8 buildings, including what was clearly a large hall that matched descriptions of Viking longhouses found in Iceland and Greenland. They found a forge where iron had been worked, the only such site from this time period anywhere in North America. They discovered a specialized hut where bog iron had been processed into usable metal, using techniques that were identical to methods used by Vikings in Scandinavia. Most importantly, they found evidence of daily life. Cooking hearths where families had prepared meals, sleeping areas where people had spent winters, workshops where craftsmen had made tools and repaired equipment. This wasn't evidence of a brief stop for repairs or a temporary camp used by exploring expeditions. This was a functioning settlement where people had lived and worked and planned for the future. The carbon dating results came back with dates clustering around 1,000 years ago. Not 900 years ago, not 1,100 years ago, but exactly 1,000 years ago, exactly when the sagas said Leif Erikson had reached Vinland. The archaeological evidence at Lancer-aux Meadows proved beyond any reasonable doubt that Vikings had reached North America and established a settlement there 500 years before Columbus. But here's where the detective story gets even more interesting. The evidence also showed that they hadn't stayed very long. The buildings showed signs of use, but not of long-term occupation. There weren't massive middens full of garbage that would suggest years of continuous habitation. There weren't signs of major repairs or expansions that would indicate a growing, permanent community. Everything suggested that Lancer-aux Meadows had been occupied for maybe a few years, maybe a decade at most, and then it had been abandoned. So the archaeological investigation that proved Vikings had reached America also raised the biggest question of all. Why didn't they stay? This question became even more intriguing when archaeologists realized that Lancer-aux Meadows wasn't necessarily Vinland itself, but might have been a base camp for exploring the larger Vinland region described in the sagas. The site was perfectly positioned for ship repair and resupply. It had a good harbour that could accommodate multiple longships. It had access to bog iron for metalworking. It was located at the entrance to the Gulf of St. Lawrence, which would have provided access to the interior regions where the sagas described finding wild grapes and abundant timber. In other words, Lancer-aux Meadows might have been exactly what Vikings needed for supporting extended exploration and potential settlement of a much larger area. The fact that they abandoned it suggests that something went wrong, not necessarily something catastrophic, but something that made them decide that the benefits of staying didn't outweigh the costs of maintaining a settlement so far from their support networks in Greenland and Iceland. Climate change might have been a factor. The medieval warm period that had made Greenland settlement possible was beginning to end around the year 1100. Cooler temperatures would have made farming in Greenland more difficult and might have forced Vikings to focus their resources on maintaining existing settlements rather than expanding into new territories. Conflict with indigenous peoples might have played a role. The sagas describe both peaceful trade and violent confrontations between Vikings and native peoples, they called skraelings. If conflicts escalated beyond what a small settlement could handle, withdrawal might have seemed like the prudent choice. Distance from support networks was certainly a factor. Lancer-aux Meadows was separated from the nearest Norse settlement in Greenland by hundreds of miles of dangerous ocean travel. Maintaining regular supply lines would have been difficult and expensive, but the more we understand about Viking capabilities, their shipbuilding technology, their navigation skills, their experience with establishing successful settlements in challenging environments, the more we realize that none of these obstacles were insurmountable. Vikings had successfully settled Iceland and Greenland despite similar challenges. They had proven they could maintain settlements across vast distances and adapt to unfamiliar environments. The mystery isn't whether they could have established successful permanent settlements in North America. The mystery is why they chose not to. And that mystery leads us to one of the most fascinating questions in all of alternate history. What if they had made a different choice? What if a few more ships had followed Leif Erikson's initial expedition? What if Thorfinn Karlsefni had decided to stay in Vinland permanently instead of returning to Greenland? What if climate change hadn't forced Vikings to abandon their westward expansion? The answer to those questions would have changed not just American history, but the entire trajectory of global development. Because by the time Spanish conquistadors began exploring the Caribbean in the late 1500s, they might have encountered something completely unexpected along the North American coast. Organized North American societies with sophisticated political systems, advanced technologies, and populations that were numerous, healthy, and well prepared to defend their territories. Now we're getting to the part of our alternate timeline that reads like the most epic historical action movie never made. Because if Viking settlements had taken root and thrived in North America, the confrontation between North America and the Spanish Empire would have been unlike anything that actually happened in our timeline. Let's fast forward to the year 1500. In our alternate world, North America has had 5 centuries to develop, grow, and evolve into something completely unprecedented in human history. Picture the scene. Spanish explorers sailing north from their newly established bases in the Caribbean expect to find the same kinds of scattered indigenous tribes they've been encountering throughout their conquest of Central and South America. What they find instead changes everything they thought they knew about the New World. As Spanish galleons round the coast of what we call Florida and head north toward the Chesapeake Bay, lookouts spot something that shouldn't exist. Armed longships, flying raven banners, patrolling waters that were supposed to be unexplored wilderness. These aren't the same longships that Leif Erikson used 500 years earlier. 5 centuries of American innovation has created something entirely new. North American shipyards have been producing hybrid vessels that combine traditional Scandinavian shallow draft design with indigenous birchbark construction techniques and materials that don't exist anywhere else in the world. The result is ships that are faster, more maneuverable, and better adapted to American coastal conditions than anything Europeans have ever seen. They can disappear into shallow bays and river mouths, where deep-draft Spanish galleons can't follow, then emerge to strike with devastating precision. But the real shock for Spanish explorers comes when they attempt to make contact with what they assume will be primitive coastal settlements. Instead, they encounter organized North American confederations with sophisticated political systems, advanced metallurgy, and military technologies that represent 5 centuries of innovation building on both European and indigenous traditions. When Hernán Cortés attempts to explore the North American coast in 1519, just 2 years before he would begin his conquest of the Aztec Empire, he faces not scattered tribes with stone weapons, but coordinated North American naval forces with iron weapons, cavalry adapted to American conditions, and alliance networks that span the continent. Picture the first major naval engagement. Spanish galleons with their heavy cannons and high wooden sides, facing sleek Viking vessels that can outmaneuver them in coastal waters. The Spanish have superior firepower, but the North Americans have superior knowledge of local conditions and tactics adapted to American geography. The Spanish discover that their standard conquistador playbook doesn't work against opponents who have European-level military technology combined with indigenous knowledge about American terrain and weather patterns. When Cortés attempts to establish a beachhead for further exploration, he finds himself facing not just the immediate North American coastal settlements, but organized resistance that draws on alliance networks, stretching from the Atlantic coast to the Great Lakes. Because here's what 5 centuries of Norse indigenous cultural blending has created: political confederations that combine Viking thing assemblies with indigenous council traditions, creating decision-making systems that can coordinate responses across vast territories. When North American scouts bring word that Spanish ships have appeared off the coast, the response isn't just local. Messages travel along established trade routes to allied communities hundreds of miles inland. Within weeks, reinforcements are moving toward the coast using river systems and overland trails that Spanish explorers don't even know exist. The Spanish find themselves facing something they've never encountered before: organized, unified resistance from societies that have had centuries to develop both European-style military technologies and indigenous-style knowledge about American geography and tactics. But the confrontation isn't just military. It's also economic and technological. North America in 1500 has had 5 centuries to develop trade networks that span the continent. They're not just trading local products like furs and timber. They're moving goods from the Pacific coast to the Atlantic coast, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, through established relationships with indigenous peoples that Spanish conquistadors are only beginning to encounter. When Spanish explorers arrive expecting to find unexploited resources and scattered peoples who can be easily dominated, they instead find established trade networks, organized political systems, and societies that are already extracting and processing American resources on a scale that rivals anything happening in Europe. The economic implications are staggering. Spanish colonial policy depended on extracting wealth from the Americas to fund European wars and expansion. But North America has already been developing American resources for centuries, creating economic systems that are integrated with European markets but not dependent on European control. When Spanish traders attempt to establish the kinds of exploitative relationships that worked in Central and South America, they discover that North Americans are sophisticated negotiators who understand European markets and aren't interested in accepting unfavorable terms. The technological confrontation is equally dramatic. Spanish conquistadors succeeded in Mexico and Peru, partly because they had overwhelming technological advantages: steel weapons against obsidian, horses against foot soldiers, gunpowder weapons against traditional bows and arrows. But North Americans have had 5 centuries to develop hybrid technologies that combine the best of European and indigenous innovations. Their weapons combine European metallurgy with indigenous materials and designs. Their cavalry includes not just European horses, but also domesticated American animals that Spanish explorers have never seen before. Their defensive systems use both European-style fortifications and indigenous knowledge about terrain and natural barriers. Most importantly, they have technologies that don't exist anywhere else in the world. 5 centuries of innovation in American conditions has created solutions to problems that Europeans have never had to solve. For example, North American shipbuilders have developed vessels specifically designed for navigating American river systems, allowing them to project power deep into the continental interior in ways that Spanish galleons simply can't match. Their agricultural systems produce surplus food that can support large populations and extended military campaigns. Their metallurgy has access to American copper and silver deposits that have been worked for centuries, using techniques that combine European and indigenous methods. Their information networks allow them to coordinate responses across distances that would take Spanish colonial administrators months to traverse. The result is a confrontation between Spanish imperial expansion and North American confederation that creates a completely different dynamic than what happened in our historical timeline. Instead of European technological superiority allowing rapid conquest, you have a situation more like the confrontations between European powers and established Asian empires, complex political negotiations backed by military capabilities that are roughly comparable on both sides. The Spanish quickly realize that North America can't be conquered using the same methods that worked against the Aztec and Inca empires. They're dealing with societies that have European-level technology, sophisticated political organization, and detailed knowledge about American geography and resources. More importantly, North Americans have been developing immunity to European diseases for centuries. The demographic collapse that made Spanish conquest possible in Central and South America simply doesn't happen in North America. Instead of arriving to find populations devastated by epidemic diseases, Spanish explorers encounter healthy, numerous societies that are well organized and capable of sustained resistance. The confrontation forces both sides to develop new approaches to international relations. The Spanish can't simply impose their will through superior technology and epidemic disease. The North Americans can't simply ignore European expansion and hope it goes away. What emerges is something like a Cold War 500 years before the actual Cold War, a tense standoff between expanding empires with roughly comparable capabilities, but fundamentally different approaches to territorial control and economic organization. Spanish colonial policy emphasizes extraction of wealth to support European wars and expansion. North American confederations emphasize sustainable development of American resources to support American populations. Spanish political systems concentrate power in royal governors answerable to the crown in Madrid. North American confederations distribute power through thing assemblies and council systems that require consensus building across diverse communities. Spanish military strategy depends on projecting power from fortified bases using professional soldiers. North American military strategy emphasizes mobility, local knowledge, and alliance networks that can coordinate responses across vast territories. The result is a stalemate that forces both sides to negotiate rather than simply imposing their will through conquest. But the confrontation between Spanish imperialism and North American confederation would have implications far beyond North America, because the existence of a successful alternative to European colonization would provide a model for indigenous resistance throughout the Americas. When news reaches South America that Spanish expansion has been blocked by organized North American resistance, it provides inspiration and practical guidance for indigenous peoples who are facing their own confrontations with Spanish conquistadors. The Inca resistance in Peru, the Mapuche resistance in Chile, and other indigenous movements gain access to new strategies, new technologies, and new forms of political organization that allow them to more effectively resist European conquest. The ripple effects spread throughout the Atlantic world, changing not just the balance of power in the Americas, but the entire trajectory of European expansion and global economic development. Spain's inability to dominate North America as completely as they dominated Central and South America means less wealth flowing back to Europe, which affects European wars, politics, and economic development. The existence of North American confederations as an alternative model of American development influences European thinking about colonization, governance, and the relationship between European and indigenous peoples. Most importantly, it demonstrates that the catastrophic collision between Europeans and indigenous Americans wasn't inevitable. Alternative forms of cultural contact and political organization were not just possible, but practical. The confrontation between Spanish steel and Viking iron in our alternate timeline shows us that history isn't a story of inevitable European dominance, but a complex process of cultural interaction that could have developed in very different directions. But to understand just how different those directions might have been, we need to visit the America that never was, the cities, the cultures, and the innovations that might have emerged from 5 centuries of Norse indigenous collaboration. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine walking through the streets of New Bergen in the year 1600. You're standing in the heart of what might have been America's first great city, not a European city transplanted to America, but a genuinely new kind of urban center that exists nowhere else in the world. The morning sun reflects off the harbor, where longships with shallow drafts and distinctive square sails dock alongside indigenous canoes that can carry tons of cargo from trading partners hundreds of miles upriver. The air smells like salt water, wood smoke, and something else, the distinctive scent of bog iron being smelted in workshops that combine Norse metallurgy with American materials. As you walk up from the harbor district, you notice that the streets themselves tell the story of cultural fusion. The broad avenues are laid out according to Norse town planning principles, but they're lined with buildings that combine longhouse architecture with indigenous construction techniques adapted to American climate conditions. Some buildings are clearly recognizable as Norse-style longhouses, with their distinctive steep-pitched roofs and central hearths. But look more closely, and you'll see that they've been modified using indigenous knowledge about American weather patterns. The roofs use local materials that provide better insulation than traditional sod. The walls incorporate bark panels that offer superior moisture control in American humidity. Other buildings are clearly influenced by indigenous architectural traditions, but they're built using Norse metalworking tools and construction techniques that allow for larger, more complex structures than traditional wigwams or bark houses. The result is an architectural style that exists nowhere else in the world, something that's neither purely European nor purely indigenous, but genuinely and uniquely American. As you continue up the main avenue, you hear the sound of multiple languages being spoken simultaneously. Children switch effortlessly between Old Norse and Algonquian languages as they play games that combine traditional Norse athletic competitions with indigenous sports. Adults conduct business negotiations in whichever language works best for the particular transaction, often mixing vocabulary from both traditions. The central square showcases the political innovation that makes Norse America possible. On one side stands a traditional Viking thing assembly area, with raised earthworks where community leaders gather to debate laws and make collective decisions. On the other side sits an indigenous council circle, with carefully arranged stones where representatives from different clans and tribes meet to discuss matters that affect the broader community. But the really revolutionary part is that both systems operate simultaneously. Major decisions require consensus from both the thing assembly and the council circle. This isn't one culture dominating another. It's a genuinely new form of democratic government that combines the best elements of both traditions. The economic activity in the square demonstrates the incredible prosperity that 5 centuries of cultural blending has created. Merchants are trading goods that represent the wealth of an entire continent: copper from the Great Lakes region, silver from what we would call Colorado, exotic woods from the Pacific coast, and seashells from the Gulf of Mexico. But they're also trading manufactured goods that represent 5 centuries of technological innovation, tools that combine Norse metalworking with indigenous materials, textiles that blend Scandinavian weaving techniques with American fibers, weapons that incorporate both European metallurgy and indigenous designs, optimized for American hunting and warfare. Most, remarkably, you notice that the traders include people whose ancestry clearly represents multiple cultural backgrounds. These aren't separate Norse and indigenous communities that occasionally interact. This is a genuinely integrated society, where cultural mixing has been happening for generations. The children playing in the square have names that combine Norse and indigenous elements. They're equally comfortable participating in traditional Norse seasonal celebrations and indigenous harvest ceremonies. They're learning to read runes carved into birch bark and to interpret traditional indigenous pictographs with equal fluency. As you explore the residential areas, you discover family compounds that showcase the domestic innovations of Norse American culture. Houses that combine longhouse-style central hearths with indigenous knowledge about food preservation and storage. Gardens that grow traditional Scandinavian crops like barley and rye, alongside indigenous crops like corn, beans, and squash, using agricultural techniques that draw from both traditions. The food being prepared in these kitchens represents a genuinely new cuisine that combines ingredients and cooking methods that had never been brought together before European contact. Traditional Norse preservation techniques applied to American fish and game. Indigenous knowledge about local plants and seasonings applied to European-style breads and dairy products. Some families are clearly of mixed ancestry, with grandparents who remember the early days of cultural contact and grandchildren who see Norse and indigenous traditions as equally natural parts of their heritage. The religious practices in Norse America represent another form of cultural innovation. Some families maintain traditional Norse spiritual practices, honoring Thor and Odin alongside Christian saints. Others follow indigenous spiritual traditions that honor ancestral spirits and natural forces. But many families have developed hybrid practices that combine elements from both traditions. Churches built in Norse architectural styles but decorated with indigenous artistic motifs. Seasonal celebrations that honor both European and American agricultural cycles. Burial practices that incorporate both Norse concepts of honored ancestors and indigenous concepts of connection to the land. The educational institutions showcase the intellectual achievements of Norse American culture. Schools where children learn to read Latin, Old Norse, and indigenous languages with equal facility. Centers of learning where scholars study European texts alongside indigenous oral traditions, creating new forms of knowledge that didn't exist anywhere else in the world. The technological workshops represent the cutting edge of 15th and 16th century innovation. Smithies, where craftsmen combine European metallurgy with American materials to create tools and weapons that are superior to anything being produced in Europe. shipyards where builders combine Norse shallow draft design with indigenous materials and techniques to create vessels that are perfectly adapted to American coastal and river conditions. Textile workshops where weavers combine Scandinavian techniques with American fibers like cotton and indigenous plant materials to create fabrics that are more durable and better adapted to American climate conditions than traditional European textiles. Most importantly, research centers where natural philosophers study American plants and animals using both European scientific methods and indigenous knowledge systems, creating new understanding about medicine, agriculture, and natural resource management. As evening approaches, you witness the social institutions that make this cultural fusion possible. Community gatherings where decisions are made through processes that combine Norse thing assemblies with indigenous council traditions. Economic institutions that balance individual property rights with collective resource management. Military organizations that combine European-style professional soldiers with indigenous-style warrior societies. The evening entertainment showcases the artistic achievements of Norse American culture. Music that combines Scandinavian instrumental traditions with indigenous vocal techniques and American instruments. Stories that blend Norse saga traditions with indigenous oral history, creating new forms of epic literature that celebrate both European and American heroes. Athletic competitions that combine traditional Norse sports with indigenous games, creating new forms of physical competition that are perfectly adapted to American geography and climate conditions. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this alternate America is something you can't see directly: the demographic reality that makes everything else possible. In our historical timeline, European diseases devastated indigenous populations within a century of contact, creating the demographic collapse that made European colonization possible. But in North America, gradual contact over centuries has allowed indigenous populations to develop immunity to European diseases, while maintaining their numbers and political organization. The result is a North America where indigenous peoples remain the majority population, but where European settlers have become permanent residents and cultural contributors, rather than temporary extractors or conquerors. This demographic balance creates political and economic systems that are fundamentally different from anything that developed in our historical timeline. Europeans can't dominate through superior numbers or technological advantages. Indigenous peoples can't simply ignore European presence and maintain traditional isolation. Instead, both groups have been forced to develop new forms of cooperation, new institutions, and new cultural practices that allow different peoples to share the same territories while maintaining their distinct identities. The legal systems that govern property ownership, resource use, and conflict resolution represent genuine innovations that combine European concepts of individual rights with indigenous concepts of collective responsibility. The economic systems balance European-style trade and accumulation with indigenous-style sustainability and resource conservation. The political systems distribute power in ways that require consensus building across cultural boundaries, while maintaining efficiency in decision-making and implementation. By 1600, North America represents something that has never existed anywhere else in human history: a genuinely multicultural society that preserves distinct cultural traditions while creating new institutions and practices that allow different peoples to thrive together. This isn't the melting pot model where different cultures blend until their distinct characteristics disappear. It's not the segregation model where different peoples maintain separation and avoid interaction. It's something entirely new: a confederation model where distinct cultures maintain their own institutions and practices while participating in shared political and economic systems that benefit everyone. The innovations developed in North America, political systems that balance individual rights with collective responsibility, economic systems that balance accumulation with sustainability, social systems that balance cultural preservation with integration, represent solutions to problems that societies around the world are still struggling to solve. But the most profound impact of North America isn't what it created within its own borders. It's how its existence would have changed the entire trajectory of global development. The demonstration that European and indigenous peoples could develop successful partnerships rather than relationships of conquest and exploitation would have provided a model for colonial encounters throughout the Americas. The economic prosperity generated through sustainable resource development rather than extraction would have created different patterns of global trade and wealth distribution. The political innovations that allowed different cultures to govern themselves collectively would have influenced thinking about democracy, federalism, and international relations throughout the Atlantic world. Most importantly, the simple fact that an alternative to European colonial domination was not just possible but practical would have changed how people throughout the world thought about cultural contact, political organization, and human possibility. The America that history never saw wasn't just different from the America that actually developed. It was better, not perfect, not without conflicts and challenges, but better in fundamental ways that matter for human flourishing and cultural diversity. Understanding what might have been helps us appreciate both what we gained and what we lost through the particular path that American development actually took. As we reach the end of our journey through the America that might have been, I want you to think about something that goes far beyond Vikings and longships and alternate timelines. Because understanding what almost happened with Norse colonization reveals fundamental truths about how history actually works. Truths that change how we see not just the past, but the present and future as well. Here's the big revelation: history isn't inevitable. The America we know, with its particular mix of cultures, languages, and traditions, didn't develop because it was somehow predetermined or natural, or the only way things could have worked out. It developed because of specific choices, environmental factors, and chance encounters that could have unfolded very differently. Think about the chain of events that prevented successful Viking colonization of America. The Little Ice Age that began around 1300 made Greenland farming increasingly difficult, cutting the supply lines that Norse American settlements would have needed for survival. But the Little Ice Age was a climate phenomenon that lasted from roughly 1300 to 1800. It wasn't permanent. If Norse settlements had survived that 500-year period, they would have emerged into a warming climate with established populations, developed technologies, and sophisticated knowledge about American resources and conditions. Consider the demographic factors. The historical Norse settlements in Greenland supported several thousand people for almost 500 years before finally being abandoned. If similar populations had been established in the more favorable climate of North America, they could have grown to tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands by the time other European powers began serious Atlantic exploration. Think about the technological possibilities. Vikings in the year 1000 already had ironworking, sophisticated shipbuilding, navigation techniques that worked reliably across thousands of miles of open ocean, and proven systems for establishing successful settlements in harsh environments. 500 years of development in American conditions, with access to American resources and indigenous knowledge, would have created technologies and capabilities that surpassed anything available in Europe. But the most important factor, the one that would have changed everything, was the potential for different patterns of cultural contact. The catastrophic epidemics that devastated indigenous populations after European contact weren't inevitable. They were the result of sudden, massive exposure to unfamiliar diseases by populations that had been completely isolated from Old World pathogens for thousands of years. Gradual contact over generations would have allowed indigenous populations to develop immunity while maintaining their numbers and political organization. Instead of demographic collapse creating opportunities for European conquest, you would have had demographic stability, supporting continued indigenous political and economic power. This changes everything about how European colonization would have developed. The Spanish conquistadors who successfully conquered the Aztec and Inca empires did so through a combination of superior military technology, epidemic disease, and political manipulation of existing conflicts between indigenous groups. None of these advantages would have applied in North America. Military technology would have been roughly comparable after centuries of technological exchange. Epidemic disease wouldn't have created demographic collapse, and indigenous Norse hybrid societies would have presented unified rather than fragmented political opposition. The economic implications are staggering. Spanish colonial wealth came primarily from extracting precious metals using forced indigenous labor. But North America would have been built around sustainable development of American resources through cooperative labor systems. Instead of wealth flowing from America to Europe to fund European wars, you would have had wealth circulating within American economies to fund American development. This would have created completely different patterns of global trade, different balances of political power, and different relationships between European and American societies. But the implications go beyond economics and politics. The existence of North America would have demonstrated that the catastrophic collision between European and indigenous peoples wasn't inevitable. Partnership was possible. Cultural blending was possible. Political systems that balanced different traditions and interests were possible. The demonstration that alternative forms of cultural contact could work would have influenced how Europeans approached colonization throughout the Americas, Africa, and Asia. Indigenous peoples facing European expansion would have had access to successful models of resistance and negotiation. European colonizers would have been forced to develop more sophisticated approaches to cultural contact and political negotiation. The ripple effects would have spread throughout the Atlantic world and beyond, creating different approaches to international relations, different concepts of cultural interaction, and different possibilities for human cooperation across cultural boundaries. Most importantly, understanding what almost happened helps us see that the particular forms of inequality, exploitation, and cultural domination that characterized European colonization weren't natural or inevitable consequences of cultural contact. They were the results of specific historical circumstances that could have developed differently. This matters for how we understand the present world. The global inequalities that exist today between formerly colonized and formerly colonizing societies aren't the natural result of cultural differences or inherent capabilities. They're the legacy of particular historical processes that created certain patterns of wealth extraction, political domination, and cultural suppression. Understanding that those processes weren't inevitable helps us see that current inequalities aren't inevitable either. Different choices, different policies, and different approaches to international relations could create different outcomes. The political innovations that might have developed in North America, systems that balanced individual rights with collective responsibility, institutions that allowed different cultures to govern themselves cooperatively, economic systems that prioritized sustainability over extraction, represent solutions to problems that societies around the world are still struggling to solve. Climate change, cultural conflict, economic inequality, and political polarization are challenges that require exactly the kinds of innovative thinking and cooperative problem-solving that North America might have pioneered centuries ago. But the most profound lesson from our exploration of Viking America isn't about politics or economics or technology. It's about human possibility. The story of what might have been shows us that human societies are capable of remarkable creativity and adaptation when they're forced to solve new problems and develop new forms of cooperation. The North Americans we've imagined weren't superhuman. They were ordinary people responding to extraordinary circumstances. The challenge of building something new in an unfamiliar environment, the necessity of cooperating with people from very different cultural backgrounds, the opportunity to combine different knowledge systems and create innovations that neither culture could have achieved alone. But those extraordinary circumstances brought out capabilities that might never have been discovered under more ordinary conditions. This is true for all human societies. We're capable of much more creativity, cooperation, and innovation than we usually demonstrate under normal circumstances. But extraordinary challenges can reveal extraordinary capabilities. The climate change, technological disruption, and cultural mixing that characterize our current world represent exactly the kinds of extraordinary circumstances that call for extraordinary human responses. Understanding that North Americans might have developed remarkable innovations in political cooperation, economic sustainability, and cultural integration should inspire us to believe that we're capable of developing equally remarkable innovations in response to our current challenges. The specific solutions that might have worked in North America won't necessarily work in the 21st century. But the underlying human capabilities that would have made those solutions possible, creativity, adaptability, and the ability to cooperate across cultural differences, are still available to us. History is full of examples of human societies developing unexpected solutions to seemingly impossible problems. The Norse expansion across the North Atlantic was one example. The development of democratic institutions in medieval Iceland was another. The creation of trade networks that spanned continents in the medieval period was a third. Our current challenges are different from anything humans have faced before, but they're not necessarily more difficult than challenges that previous generations have successfully addressed. The story of Viking America reminds us that history is made by human choices, not by inevitable forces. No, the future will be shaped by the choices we make today, not by predetermined patterns that we can't influence. Understanding what almost happened in the past helps us see more clearly what might be possible in the future. The America that Vikings might have built wasn't perfect. It would have had conflicts, inequalities, and problems that we can only imagine. But it would have been fundamentally different from the America that actually developed, and in many ways it might have been better, more cooperative, more sustainable, more respectful of cultural diversity, and more innovative in developing solutions to complex problems. The fact that such an America was possible, not inevitable, but possible, should inspire us to believe that equally remarkable alternatives are possible for the challenges we face today. We're not prisoners of historical forces beyond our control. We're inheritors of human capabilities that have been proven throughout history to be capable of remarkable creativity and innovation when circumstances require it. The Vikings who might have built America weren't fundamentally different from us. They were human beings with the same basic capabilities and limitations that we have today. If they could have created something remarkable through cooperation, innovation, and adaptation to new circumstances, then we can create something equally remarkable in response to our circumstances. That's the real lesson from our journey through the America that never was. Not that we should wish history had developed differently, but that we should believe more strongly in our own capacity to shape the future. The story ends, but the possibilities are just beginning.